much, Heather, for the introduction. I hope you can hear me okay. And I'm going to just share my slides in a second. Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. And thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to say a few words here. It's a tremendous event, so I look forward to seeing what all the awards are going to be. I want to spend some time to talk about the connection between COVID-19 and climate. It's hard to focus on something else other than COVID-19 these days, but I felt we could at least try to make it in a productive way for us and see how and what we could learn from that. It's been difficult, but also interesting to see how this global health crisis is unfolding and how we have responded. But I feel we could try to reflect on some of the common elements and some of the differences between the health crisis and climate change or sustainability as a whole. So here's the basic idea. In many countries, we've kind of understood the global threat, and we've been relatively successful in most places taking rapid action to contain the virus. So maybe using our knowledge, standing up as a society and collectively addressing problems, could we deal with climate change in a similarly effective way? Well, maybe, right? The case I'm trying to make is that I think the challenges are not necessarily going to get easier to solve in the future, but at least there's opportunities to understand and to learn and to reflect on some of the roles that we have as individual scientists and as higher education institutions in dealing with complex problems. As a side note, of course, many people have written about this, and I don't claim any of this is original. Also, I'm a climate scientist by training, climate modeler, and I don't claim to be an expert on viruses or societal decision making. But I think after reading a little bit and thinking about it, we can make some first observations that there are some shared elements between COVID-19 and climate change or sustainability. The first one is that in the beginning, some of these threats are often quite abstract. They seem to be far away. In the climate case, it's far in the future. In the virus case, it's in China. It's not something we personally experienced. And we're relatively poor in making decisions on things we are not familiar with, and when the threats or consequences are unclear. And it looks complex and difficult to understand, although, as we might argue, maybe it isn't that complex in some respect. The second is we're dealing with a common good. In one case, it's public health. In the other case, it's the planet. And everybody benefits if we jointly try to solve these things. We need to realize that money is not the only thing that counts. And indeed, we have kind of demonstrated, at least in most places, that we can collectively take actions and act quickly if we need to. The third common theme is that there's a delay between the decisions and seeing the consequences. Taking the fact seriously and deciding early has huge benefits, while the delays are problematic. It limits the options later. Delay means potentially huge costs later and long-term commitment. Right? In climate, it's basically that most of the climate change is irreversible once it's there. In the pandemic crisis, it's almost unstoppable once the number of cases is too high. So early action is important. And the fourth common element is that scientific expertise and experts who are willing to stand up and engage are critical. From understanding how epidemics work to developing vaccines, we do rely on the science all the time now. So given all these common elements, maybe if we get COVID-19 under control, we might also succeed on climate change or other sustainability-related problems. Well, maybe, right? There are, of course, also important differences. One of them is that the danger in climate change is less immediate and personal. Of course, it's happening already now, but very few of us are going to die this week or next week. For the virus, you could see quickly what you had to decide to make a difference. Climate is not something you can fix within a few weeks or a lockdown that happens quickly. It requires a very long effort over decades, if not centuries. The second important difference is that for the virus, at least initially, there was very little politics involved in most countries, I would say, on what to do. From left to right, we all wanted to save lives, and and the only way to do that was to minimize contact. There was really no alternative. For climate, we may agree on the risks, but we may disagree on what to do about it. The priorities and values we have depend on personal, economic interests, culture, and those who are around us and who are similarly interested and like-minded as we are. The immediate action for the lockdown was only possible because we all agreed on the threat, and we all agreed that this was the only way to save lives. But you can see the disagreement already starting now, how difficult it is, whether we should continue or not with a lockdown. And the third important difference is that while the government could dictate emergency measure in the last weeks, we cannot really justify such a process to address the Sustainable Development Goals or climate change. We need to agree on what to do in a democratic way using established principles so that we can maintain these efforts for decades. So when you start to combine all these aspects, it's hard to come to clear conclusions. The potential list of points is long, but here's a few elements that come up again and again. On the positive side, it seems like, as we discussed before, we are capable, at least in the short term, to act in a solidaric way because we all benefit. We've done remarkable things in the last week in this crisis. In Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters, the first one being danger and the second one being something like change point. The disruption or change point may question existing structures and values and offer us an opportunity to think differently and maybe do something that we haven't thought we were capable of. These shared elements might give us at least some hope. Maybe we are capable of really acting if we need to. The second is that we do have an opportunity to design the economic stimulus packages in a way that we invest in a future that is sort of climate proof or sustainability proof rather than just rebuilding what we had before. On the challenging side, there are a number of them. One is the national interests. We see in these situations that our own country, our own business usually comes first, borders are closed. So solving global crises may get harder from that perspective. And finally, there is of course the debate about the price we're paying for saving lives. And that's a complex argument to dissect. And just very briefly, the question of priorities is of course really important. We do need to ask these questions and we do need to discuss what measures are appropriate. And that also means looking at costs. Some people argue that we cannot quantify the value of a human life. And indeed, cost benefit is dangerous in general. And it's horrible when you have to put a price tag on a year lost in a life. But we do, of course, implicitly do that all the time. By looking at how much money you spend for safety on the roads to fight air pollution or how much money we spend on development aid in developing countries, we implicitly put a price tag on a human life. But these arguments are often used as sort of false dichotomies between the economy on one hand and the planet or the public health and the COVID crisis on the other hand. The suggestion being that we get either one of those is, I think, wrong. In fact, science is showing that many of the measures that protect public health are also the ones that help the economy in the long term. And in climate, science has long demonstrated that limiting warming to less than 2 degrees is the most cost-effective strategy. If you think long term, and that's a big if, of course, then it's cheaper to mitigate and reduce CO2 emissions than to pay later for the damages. So it seems like we know what we should do, but still, it's not happening in many cases. Sherwood Rowlands won the Nobel Prize for discovering that chlorofluorocarbons contribute to ozone depletion. And he once said, and I quote, "What's the use of having developed a science well enough to make predictions if, in the end, all we're willing to do is stand around and wait for them to come true?" Well, I would say he has a point. It would be stupid to ignore all the science that we have and not do anything about it. But it assumes that we're all rational and act in the interest of society at large. And sometimes we don't. Even a perfect prediction does not imply consensus on what to do about the prediction, because shared facts do not imply shared values. So is it because people are stupid? No. In this paper, the authors looked at how concerns on climate change is related to education. And they found that the members of the public with the highest degree of science literacy and technical reasoning capacity were not the most concerned about climate change. And further, I quote again, this result suggests that the public divisions over climate change stem not from the public's incomprehension of science, but from a distinctive conflict of interest between the personal interest individuals have in forming beliefs in line with those held by others with whom they share close ties, and the collective one they all share in making use of the best available science to promote common welfare, which essentially says that your personal view on climate change is influenced less by facts and more by what people around you think about that topic that are close to you and that share similar values as you do. So it's not always an intellectual problem, it's a problem of worldviews. Addressing climate change requires a strong government. It probably requires investments in public infrastructure, maybe in higher taxes. That, very simply put, fits into the narrative of the left parties, but not the ones on the right. So as a consequence, some people deny the science and attack the experts, the governments, saying it's about the science, but really it's not about the science. It's because they disagree with the proposed action that follows from the science. It's not about the science, it's a collision of worldviews. In the Hartwell paper from 2010, written shortly after the failure of the Copenhagen Conference of the Parties in 2009, the authors talk about the deficit model of science. They say, they describe it as the expert scientist pours knowledge into the ignorant and passive heads of the public and their representative. Their deficit is remedied. They trust the expert's superior knowledge and qualifications, and the scientist then leverages that power to instruct further the ignorant public and to delineate the correct action to remedy the situation which the expert has described. This error in their view, has led to the common and flawed assumption that the solutions to climate change should be science-driven, as if a shared understanding of science will lead to political consensus. Note that they do not say that knowledge is not necessary or not important. They just say that it's not sufficient in itself to reach consensus on what to do. If I care only about my personal life and the next week, why would I bother about climate or sustainability? If I care about my kids or the world as a whole, then my conclusions may be very different, even though the facts haven't changed. So as scientists, we do produce knowledge, that's obvious, but what is our role in the public debate? It's challenging. The epidemiologists just experienced what climate scientists have been witnessing for 20 plus years, namely that the discussion of science in the public in topics that are so hotly debated is really difficult. When is it appropriate to go public? When is it appropriate to warn? Should you just provide numbers or should you recommend policies? Are you speaking on behalf of yourself or an institution or even a government? Do we have a moral obligation to speak up? If you speak up, you get attacked for being unscientific and going beyond your role as a scientist. The United Nations IPCC reports want their reports to be policy relevant, but never policy prescriptive. But what is that even possible? If I say we need to go to zero emissions to achieve the Paris climate targets, is that a political statement or is it just a fact? Of course, it's both. It's a politically relevant statement because it says we need to, but it's also a fact that follows strictly from the Paris Agreement that we have all adopted. What happens if you don't warn and then things go wrong? This cover from Nature a few years back is from Italy in 2009, where the earthquake scientists were on trial for manslaughter, for failing to warn the public appropriately and saying the risk was low. So when we talk about experts, of course, another common theme is that the denial of science and bashing of experts is everywhere. And it's remarkable. It started with what we know as the 5 stages of denial, which are very similar in COVID-19 as in climate. The first one being it doesn't exist. Second, it's not us. Third, it's not a problem. 4, it's not expensive. or hard to, 4, sorry, it's too expensive or not too hard to fix, and 5, then it's too late. People argue it's only scenarios, it's only based on models. Then there's the common tactic of discrediting and personally attacking experts. Now all the conspiracy theories are popping up. It's quite remarkable that the deniers use the same arguments, the same narratives, and sometimes it's in fact the same people and groups who are deliberately distorting the science. Here's just one example that you may have seen, a common misinterpretation, the statement being that, see, it wasn't that bad as science predicted, the worst outcomes didn't happen, so we overreacted with the lockdown and the science was wrong. Well, sure, it didn't happen because we all stayed at home. You can try as an expert to clarify, but sometimes it doesn't help if people are not willing to listen. And again, it's not because of a lack of facts, it's on understanding. It's because these reactions that people have are deeply rooted in either a distrust in government and public institution or the media, or it's the political view that the ideal world would be one with very few rules, complete freedom, no government, free market, low taxes, and so on. So mostly it's not about the science, but it's that the proposed action based on the science conflicts with their view of how the world is or how the world should be. So all of that really doesn't provide us with a solution, but at least it helps us understanding why people argue in a stupid way and why the things are the way they are. And it often it shows us that often it's not the science that is to blame. So in summary, I don't deny, of course, the need for science and experts. Why would I? After all, I'm one of them. I'm convinced that we have essential pieces to contribute that can help solving the crisis, whatever the crisis is. Science is necessary, but we have to accept that it's not sufficient. As experts, we can contribute to the debate and the discussion by providing scenarios, what-if statements. We can say what might work. We can certainly say what won't work. We need to speak up when the facts are misrepresented, so when science is distorted. But we have to accept that we cannot make the decision ourselves. And the politicians shouldn't expect us to be able to tell them in that way. Andy Sterling, a few years back, put it in this way. Expert advice is often thought most useful to policy when it's presented as a single definitive interpretation. In this way, the policymakers are encouraged to pursue and claim science-based decisions. After years of researching and participating in science advisory processes, I've come to the conclusion that this practice is misguided. He basically argues that a more plural and conditional expert advice in the sense of what if, that makes the uncertainties and values at least transparent and explicit, is an approach that would be more democratically accountable. The COVID crisis, I'm sure, will provide a lot of opportunities to learn about how science interacts with the public, what scientists can contribute, and how the science feeds into this decision-making process. Some preliminary results of a PhD study I'm involved in suggest that the credibility of scientists is not lower when they publicly advocate for taking things seriously. A majority of both the scientists and the public wants the science and the scientists to be more present in the public discourse and in the policy debate, not less. So this should be an encouragement to all of us. So, as a scientist who produces facts, as teachers in higher education, as role models, and as individuals who inform and continue to the public debate, we need to collectively contribute everything we have. If we do that, I'm convinced that we can play an important role in shaping the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reto. That was wonderful, very thought-provoking. So I'm going to ask everyone to either submit your questions on Q&A, which is preferable if you can type them into the questions and answer section below. We already have one question. If not, then Nicola will allow you to raise your hand and she will unmute you so that you can ask it directly of Reto. So let me start with the first question. which is what is ETH Zurich doing to position themselves in terms of sustainability in the post-COVID world?
I'm not sure I can answer the post-COVID world specifically because we didn't really have an opportunity to talk about post-COVID. We're just struggling to get along with teaching and exams and so on. But we've always focused sustainability of the four pillars, being the research first. I think that's the one thing where we can not only contribute to our own behavior, but we can contribute to solutions that might scale across the world. The second being the teaching. We can educate the next generation of future leaders, and that's an important part. The third being the campus. We can, of course, try to be role models and do our best to avoid emissions on the campus, recycling, whatever. It goes from food to heating, everything. And the fourth, which I've always been kind of an advocate for, is the public discussion and outreach and dialogue. I think we have not just an opportunity, but there's a need for us to contribute to this discussion, because if we don't, these ideas are not going to reach the public and the policymakers. I don't see that changing much, although we will have to discuss what COVID-19 means specifically on how we might change our priorities.
That's wonderful. We have another question, which is, how do you see the post-COVID city planning and building design in your perspective?
Oh my God, I have very little expertise in city planning. I mean, of course, the question of mobility is an important one. How do we live and where do we live and how do we commute? If you look at the changes in the mobility, of course, that doesn't solve the climate problem. We've briefly estimated in Switzerland that if everybody works at home for 1 day a week, 1 out of 5, that would decrease emissions by maybe 2% or so, because traffic is maybe 20% and part of that is not work related. So just the fact that we work a bit more from home is not going to solve it immediately. But of course, from a perspective of infrastructure, how many trains we need, how many roads we need to think about how to best allocate resources to minimize the travel that we need to do.
Thanks for that, Reto. We also have a live question, so I'll give the floor to Erica Dawn. Erica, go ahead.
I'm sorry?
You have the floor if you have a question for Reto.
No, I'm sorry, I don't. I must have accidentally hit the button, sorry.
No problem, no problem. Okay, so we'll go to the next question, which is lobbying influences decision-making strongly. How can the lobby be broken or changed?
And these are, of course, not climate questions. I mean, lobbying is everywhere. We have to be aware that this is. I think the lobbying happens anyway from all sides to politicians. But as scientists, I think we are in a position that we can lobby for the science being correct, and this is not necessarily left or right. Of course, what we say about climate is more on what the left part of the political spectrum is saying, but in general, I think we can lobby for the facts to be taken seriously and for this decision-making process to be transparent and honest and based on the best available science. That's what I think we can lobby for.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so the next question from Melissa Goodall. We know that emissions have plummeted because of the shutdowns, but that won't really change our climate change trajectory. How can we capture COVID emissions-related best practices and use them to garner momentum for mitigating climate change in a robust way? That's more climate change, right?
Well, we know that emissions have been reduced in some places up to maybe 20%, at least temporarily. In the end, by the end of the year globally, we're thinking about maybe something like 5%. So it's going to be a little bit, but not huge. And because emissions over decades matter, this is not going to change the climate trajectory in any significant way. That's for sure. I think sometimes what happens now has been misused. The argument being that, see, we've done all this lockdown and we've killed the economy and doesn't really even help for the climate. Well, the way to solve the climate issue and the climate crisis is not to shut down the economy, but it's to change the way we produce energy. So it's decarbonizing the whole energy system so that we don't have to kill the economy in total. So I think the mechanism is entirely different how we need to solve this. I'm sure there's things we could learn from COVID-19, but it's probably too early to say.
So the next question is one very much on my mind, in particular because we have researchers at our Chan School of Public Health and our Harvard Medical School that are working very much not only on addressing COVID-19 from vaccines and other public health issues, but also turning their attention to focusing more about health in the built environment and more about health in communities. So this question is actually from our colleague and friend, Ann Kilbell. And it says, do you see an opportunity to incorporate public health into the sustainability discourse more broadly? There are perhaps, this is perhaps the ultimate multidisciplinary issue, as she writes. But what are your thoughts about the connections between COVID, climate, and public health?
It's difficult how to incorporate it in a specific way. I think public health is one of these examples we're now seeing where if you just do a cost-benefit analysis and maximize GDP, then you miss a lot of aspects. And we're now seeing the downsides of that for maybe not doing enough about public health. So I think public health is, as many other topics in these sustainable development goals, it's sort of very complex issues where the benefits are only going to be apparent later. How to connect the two, again, I'm not sure. Maybe we should open this discussion to those who are actually working on public health rather than asking climate and atmospheric scientists about public health.
Good
so
point.
If anyone feels they can contribute with a better answer, I'm happy to hear it.
Please raise your hand. But I agree. I mean, I think, Ann's point was this is a great opportunity, again, for climate scientists like yourself to be joining forces with researchers in public health, again, to align, we all want the sort of same end goals.
I mean, in general, we're of course seeing, again, that everything is interconnected, which makes it incredibly fascinating, but also incredibly hard, because it means we would need to come up with solutions that are at least not too bad for each of those sectors. And these are these wicked problems that are very hard to solve, both in terms of solutions, but also in terms of who is interacting with whom. We need to be much more broader in the way we do the science and how we interact with other people. And that the current system of doing science is not really ideal because you're not rewarded for doing interdisciplinary science.
So the next question is, most institutions, and maybe you can, I don't know how much you're involved in the administration or whatnot, but most institutions, the question says, and economies are going to feel the massive negative economic impact of lockdown regulations. How do you see universities balancing the need for dealing with unusual budget shortages versus budgets for climate change related projects? Any thoughts on that?
I have no insight in how this is going to play out in terms of budgets. I think in Switzerland, we tend to be fairly stable in terms of these, anything we do basically. We don't change quickly, which is sometimes a problem, but it's also sometimes a good thing that we don't get radical shifts in how public policy is done. I realize that this may be more challenging in other places. My personal view, and of course you could say I'm biased, is that it would be a mistake to reduce the efforts in both research and education, because on the long term, these are the things that are going to help us in solving these critical issues.
So here's a question I think a little bit more to your expertise. How can then science best serve societal and political action what is the approach of ETH Zurich in this respect, considering the points you just presented?
Well, I think we can do both, and we need to do both. We need to do the basic science because in the end, that's going to advance our understanding of how the system works. But we should also have at least part of the science contribute to things that are societally relevant. And we founded the department Environmental System Science 30 years ago, in fact, after Chernobyl, when we realized that these difficult issues in environmental systems cannot be solved by looking at just physics alone or just chemistry alone. And we need to sort of integrate the system thinking. And we also need to integrate the decision process. It's not been easy, I would say, because as I said, you're usually not rewarded for these kinds of things. But we've survived, and after 30 years, we're still here, and we're actually pretty successful. So I think the way to do it is to listen to the public and the policymakers. We have regular meetings with politicians. We also have meetings with stakeholders where we try to understand what they need and also try to educate them what we can provide. I mean, climate is a good example. Climate services is now a hot topic. How can you do climate science such that it provides an actual decision basis for adaptation, urban heat island effects, water shortages, and so on. These are challenging questions, and it's not going quickly enough, but we keep trying.
So here's a question very specific to Switzerland. The questioner asks, the COVID-19 scientific task force was put into place in Switzerland and played and still plays an important role. Do you think there'll be a scientific climate task force or maybe ways to bring climate science into this conversation?
Well, interestingly, there is a consulting board that is supposed to advise the government, and it's been established, I think, in 1996 or so, a very long time ago. But it's basically not heard, right? I mean, it's not that these people are doing the wrong things. They're very smart and they're doing interesting work, but the politicians are not always really interested. And if you look at how this has unfolded in the COVID-19 crisis, the moment when they put the task force up, I think, was end of March. So it was very, very late. And you wonder why they didn't have one in the first place, right? We could have created a task force years ago because we knew that these things would come up. And I talked to some of these people who are involved in these task forces, and they said it took them weeks and weeks of phone calls until they finally got to the point where the government was actually listening and willing to consider even such a task force to help them solving these problems. So it's been challenging in both the COVID crisis and climate. The fact that, and it goes back to what I said, the fact that you have the knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that you have the institutions and the mechanisms to provide that knowledge into the decision process.
Right. Here's another question, which I'm going to read it directly. It is a provocative one. Some propose the creation of councils of wise experts on climate change to advise governments. I think this person is reacting to your point that it's not that there needs to be more facts or more science. That's not the issue. So their question is, if more science is not what is needed, how do you think, what do you think would be the composition of a council that could provide effective guidance for governments to actually drive action?
I think the composition needs to be very broad, and we need to accept that it's not just the atmospheric scientists that need to be present in this. In fact, it needs people that work on agriculture, it needs people who work on health, it needs people who work in water systems, it needs economists, it needs probably even more so political scientists and social scientists to get us to a better understanding of what policy instruments might work. These are sometimes the hardest questions. In fact, these bodies exist. So even in Switzerland, we have one. It's just that it's mostly unheard of. But maybe reacting on the fact that no new science is needed, I don't think that's what I said. In fact, there's plenty of things where we do need more science. So if you want to build a new chairlift for a ski area somewhere in the Bernese Oberland and you want to know whether this is still worth doing in 2030, then you need to know what the local impacts on snowfall are. And probably we don't, because the question is too complex at this point. And that's the kinds of climate services that we need to make those kinds of decisions. What I said is that for certain decisions, namely to reduce CO2, we may not need more science, because we either know what to do or we cannot agree what to do.
So I think we have time maybe for one or two more questions. So again, we're sort of at the end on the Q&A. So if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a follow-up question, please do. This next one is: the coronavirus crisis makes clear that we definitely have to take into account social concerns now more than ever. The poor and powerless people suffer more on a lot of aspects. How can universities deal with the coupling of social and ecological concerns?
Oh, again, that's a hard one. I'm not sure I can say much. This is not really a climate question. It's just a general issue that we're all struggling with. But I think if we continue to do better science and educate our people, then we can make small steps. Maybe there's no solution to all of these problems, but at least there's incremental steps forward. Just briefly, Nicola, did you want to put up the poll, or do we drop that because of time?
I can do it now. I think that would actually be a really nice conclusion to the discussion.
So my motivation is that I would like to sort of gauge the people's views on whether COVID-19 might make it harder or easier to deal with other complex problems.
I'll just put it up now for you.
So if you could vote, that would be really interesting. So what do you think how COVID-19 would affect how we deal with climate change or other sustainability topics? Would it make it much harder, a bit harder, no effect, or easier, or much easier, or maybe you don't know? And it says the host and the panelists cannot vote, so I'm not going to vote.
I'll refrain from giving my comments. Great question.
I would like to know what you think, not what I said.
I see the votes are coming in very fast. I'll leave it open for a few more seconds to get the last few votes. All right, so I'll close the poll now. Can you see that, Reto?
Yeah, I can see it. So there seems to be a majority of 45% saying COVID makes it somewhat easier. Interesting. You're being optimistic, which is great.
Yes, I think probably the folks that work on sustainable development issues and climate change are naturally going to be optimistic.
You have to be. After 20, 30 years, you have to be optimistic to still do it.
Exactly. Reto, that was a very provocative and interesting and just educational comments. And we really appreciate you giving that wonderful keynote, and really kicking off, I think, what demonstrates the power of ISCN, to have people come together and talk about these complex issues in the vein of trying to think about solutions. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.